fiction, science fiction, horror, fantasy, crime, LGBT, thriller.
You have now entered the House of Mystery with your hosts, Eric Shapiro, David North Martino, John Copenhaver, and Al Warren. Heard on KTV 106.5 FM Los Angeles,
102.3 FM Riverside,
and 105.0 AM Palm Springs.
Welcome back into the House of Mystery. I'm Al Warren, and Mr. David Martino is here. He's in between his karate bouts.
Yes. In between them?
In between them.
Yeah.
Well, you know. Yeah. You got another video out there. What's going on with you with all that stuff? Like, you're doing all these kicking videos. Scaring
yeah. Well, that's what it's meant to do, Al.
Oh, okay.
I'm putting them on there just for you.
Yeah. Well
just to frighten you.
Yeah, I'm frightened. I'm worried. I won't get out of the basement. You know, it scares me. I have to get my dog to come with me.
That's right.
Well, so now speaking of scary, we've got a guy that writes some intense, I think, really good true crime books. And it's a pleasure to have him here. And I know he's got a new one out, so we've got lots to cover. So not much chit chat for us here. We just got to get to it. So, Mr. James Renner, thank you for being here.
Hey, thanks for having me on the show.
This is a pleasure because, and I'm not just blowing smoke up your dress here, because in a sense, I'm in the true crime world in the sense that I've written a lot of books and I've talked to a lot of writers and stuff, and there's a lot of great people out there. But there's certain writers that really stick out in my mind is when I listen or read their book. You really go to the case. You are there. You're part of it. You know the people involved. You know survivors. You're all around that. And I look to do that when I do a book myself. And I think it separates the true crime writers. For me, it does.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
It means a lot, because when you're there, when I was listening to like True Crime Addict and stuff, you're there. You're talking about your life. It's almost like I'm riding in the car with you when you're going around meeting people and doing things, and because you're very honest and it's very there. But it means a lot because it's the real deal. It's not just someone looking up on the internet or getting someone else's account or from another book or show. You're there. And I think that's fantastic. But that must, for me, I look at this and I think I just did that with one book, and I think it takes a ton of stamina. Like it's just very emotional. So how do you put yourself into that, and what does it do to you?
Yeah, well, it's something that I was trained to do as a reporter when I was, I started out working at the Cleveland Scene, which is our version of like Village Voice, those free papers that you find in record stores and coffee shops and CD bars. And we do long form journalism in the new journalism style, so 6,000 word features, and you're writing with emotion, and often you become a part of that story. But I was taught by my editor that if you're writing a story, you have to, and you can't just do it behind a desk. You have to go out to the scene. You have to go and meet these people face to face, because you will invariably find interesting things to describe, or sometimes even new details and new clues that were lost. And so that's just how I was trained, and the method that I used after the paper when I started writing books. And it's totally true. I recommend it to anybody that writes true crime. If you actually go out to the scene, things become much clearer than you would get just discussing it online or over the phone. A very good example of this is with the Moore Murray case, where this young woman disappeared from the side of the road in New Hampshire back in 2004. And online, when the Maura Murray case is discussed, a lot of people just kind of blow it off and say, oh, she wandered into the woods and died from the elements, because in their mind, it's a very remote part of New Hampshire in the White Mountains, and it's very remote and it's easy to get lost in those hills. But everybody that I know who's actually taken the time to drive out to the scene immediately changes their idea about the case, because you see that it really is not that remote, the place where she disappeared, and it's in view of about 3 or 4 homes, and there's a little community right on the other side of a little patch of woods. So so it matters to see where these things actually happen and not just learn about them on the internet.
Yeah, and I did that with my last true crime book that I had written a while back, and I agree. There is such a difference being there. It's almost like the JFK thing, and then people actually go to Dealey Plaza and they actually, wow, this is not how I thought it was.
Oh,
I hear that a lot.
Funny you mentioned that, because I was invited to a small true crime festival through the university, or not the university, but the Dallas Library, the main branch of the Dallas Library, which is just down the road from Dealey Plaza. So I was out there in, I think, June, and I had never actually seen Dealey Plaza, so I drove out there, and my first realization was, I can't believe how incredibly small this area is, because it looks so big, in the old Zapruder film and everything. But it's really just concentrated in this one little block in the middle, on the edge of the city. And, the book depository is still there, but it's not at all how you have it pictured in your mind if you've just watched the Zapruder film and JFK. Yeah.
It's always surprising. And I think that's a perfect example of what I mean. It's just, when I did my last one like this book, it took a lot out of me. It was a lot more emotional, and it changed me a lot. I think not only as a writer, but as a person, when you delve that deep into some true case where this really happened. It's not fiction, and you see the people, and you see the damage and the survivors, of the people that loved their loved ones and stuff. Have you ever looked at it yourself that way, and kind of like when you got finished with True Crime Addict and the Maura Murray case and stuff, and now you've gone on to the new book, but do you think you're a different person and a different writer because of that?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think each of those stories takes a little piece of your soul. For me, there comes a point in the reporting where I become invested in the case and feel responsible for, at the very least, helping it, if not, had these delusions of grandeur of solving these cases. And that definitely takes a toll. And I like to put in a lot of personal stories about what happened to me along the way to report these stories. So my true crime books end up being kind of memoirs at the same time. So they're deeply personal. I've just finished up the first draft of a book that'll be out in 2024 that's about the Boy Scouts of America, and my experience as a camp counselor at Ohio's biggest camp back in 1995, where a young man ended up dead that summer. And that one is the most personal thing I've ever written. It involves me and my friends from back then, and it explores the systemic abuse within the Boy Scouts. And I'm still recovering from the writing of that one. And, it definitely feels, more than anything I've written before, that I've put I sacrificed a bit of my soul to make that book happen. So, I think really good true crime writers and journalists in general do that. And for instance, it's a fairly new thing where you're starting to recognize the secondhand trauma that some of these journalists experienced, some of that came out of the reporting of the wars in the Middle East and Iraq and Afghanistan, where the journalists came back and exhibited symptoms of PTSD, just like the soldiers who were returning. And so I think we're a lot more aware of that now, where, I talked to some of these older writers who were reporting crime in the 50s and 60s, and I put the question to them, how did you deal with all that? And mostly they just say, well, nothing that a bottle of whiskey can't fix.
Yeah. I was going to say, yeah. That generation too, right? I mean,
yeah.
Each generation further back, the fathers coming from the wars, and then they didn't touch the kids, they didn't hug their son type thing. There's a lot of differences,
Right. I think, that works for them great, but, if you don't want to destroy your body, you got to look to therapy and medication. I don't know of any investigative journalist that isn't on some sort of anti-anxiety or anti-depression medication. Literally, all the ones that I'm friends with are on, we exchange, we don't exchange
recipes.
We discuss what we're on when we're together. It's like, oh, I'm trying clonazepam, right now. What do you want? Oh, Lexapro, that sort of stuff.
Exactly. I mean, yeah, I agree. I'm on several, but I have several issues. So that's a different story.
Me too.
So how do you come across these cases? And that's kind of a cliche question, and I get that myself. But in your particular cases, you're definitely invested in them, and they're very important to you.
Yeah.
And so what attracts you? Because you've got the new book out called Little Crazy Children, and it's another case you've covered here. So how do these fall into your lap, and what makes you decide? Because I'm sure you get a lot of people saying, hey, have you heard about this or that?
Yes.
But what would make you kind of go, oh, this is the one?
Well, first of all, it has to be unsolved, because as soon as a case is solved, I lose all interest in it. The thing that I'm really attracted to are these intricate, bizarre puzzles of cases, which is why I was attracted to the Moore Murray case, because it's such a weird case. A young nursing student who emails her professors, says there's been a death in the family, which was a lie, and then empties her bank account, packs up her stuff, and drives into the White Mountains of New Hampshire, and then disappears. So it's really two mysteries: what happened to Moore Murray, and what was she doing in the White Mountains to begin with? So that makes it a very unique puzzle. And with Little Crazy Children, my new book, it's about the Lisa Pruett case, 16-year-old girl who was stabbed to death behind a mansion in Shaker Heights. And it's a very unique case in that the story is really about how a group of entitled teenagers, the sons and daughters of lawyers and doctors and entrepreneurs, hijack a murder investigation and point the finger at a kid who had nothing to do with it just because he was the weird kid in school. So I'm looking for unsolved mysteries. I'm looking for unique cases. So if they fit into the center of all, that Venn diagram, I really become interested. And then I have to think, is this a case that's interesting enough and big enough to spend the next several years thinking about? And so that's how I kind of figure it out, and whether or not there'd be any personal interest in that, how it might affect me personally too is definitely part of it.
So, and I know when you go to a location of a case and you start finding people and all that, what's the hardest thing to do? What's the hardest thing about this type of research for you?
Well, to me, that's the real fun part is going out there and seeing these locations and kind of getting a feel for the setting, the town, the community. As far as like the hardest part is probably developing a relationship with the family the victim's family. These people have gone, I'm writing a book about what is essentially the worst day of their lives. And it all comes down to the initial meeting and how I present myself and their reception that kind of sets the tone for how the book is going to go. And the Maura Murray book was so contentious with the victim's family that I don't know that I would do another book without full cooperation with the victim's family.
Yeah, that book taught me how to do my last book.
Oh, that's a great compliment.
Because that's actually how I took it when I was listening. Like, especially there was one part where you get into a car with someone else and you're talking about you might not ever come back. How do you know? Remember that? And I was just like, this is like, well, of course you come back because the book, it wouldn't have been finished. but it's just that made a big impact. Just that whole book and how I treated it. And I made the family of my case a very big part of the book. I had them read parts. I had them write parts. And we talked. I spent a lot of time with them. And it was really important that they got their story and their feelings out. But your book did that for me. That True Crime Addict is what turned the way I write.
Oh, great. Thank you.
So,
even if it boils down to like, this is what not to do. If people can take some I don't know, learning from that, that's super cool.
Yeah, it's amazing, how, and that's kind of the thing I look at. It's amazing how a case like this can affect so many people for so many years, and just the ripple effects.
Yes.
Even how it's affected you and how much time you spent, and then how that's affected people that read or listen to your books, like me, and then how I approach another case that's nothing to do with it. There's so many, variables that come with it. And I find that fascinating myself. That's kind of what I get into. I like the cause and what it actually does more than the crime itself.
I do too. And I have this podcast that I do about once a year. I do 6 episodes of this podcast called The Philosophy of Crime. And sometimes I explore these weird questions behind true crime. And one of the episodes deals with this theory that I have when you're talking about the ripple effects of these terrible crimes. All the ones that I've looked at, there's something good that comes out of it. That, for instance, like the Amber Hagerman, this abduction that inspired the Amber Alert. And right. This one girl's abduction ends up solving hundreds of others. And so I developed this theory that, that jokingly kind of I call the Renner's second law of true crime dynamics. That there is good that comes out of these tragedies after time. Sometimes it takes a while, but there's an equal and opposite reaction of good, I think, that comes out of these tragedies.
Yeah, I agree totally with all tragedies, but it's a hard thing to say, especially to people that are grieving.
Of course, yeah.
It's true. It's so true. Actually, your philosophy of crime, I've heard those are very good.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
They
I can't
really
do it.
Stick out.
I can't do it weekly because it takes so long to write. Each episode takes me a week and a half to 2 weeks to write, and then so I write them in batches and then release them once a year. Yeah,
I like them because I'm not a podcast person, but I know a lot of podcasters, and I've heard them, some of them, but that was different. It's fresh. It's kind of a different approach. It's not just like going over a case. You actually talk about things, and
thanks.
I think that's a thumbs up.
Thank you.
So now your new book. Let's talk about that. What else what's the basic premise of this? You mentioned it a little bit about Lisa Pruett and stuff, and the kid that got accused of it and stuff. So, what did you find out?
So, this case was on my radar for a long, long time. I remember being in college at Kent State University and picking up an issue of Scene, and there was a cover story on the case where I really learned about it for the first time. That whole event where I read the story, it made me realize that I'd really like to write the way that writer wrote that story, and this long form journalism that really delves into the details. And also I disagreed with his conclusion, because he kind of concluded that Kevin Young, this weird kid in school who was blamed for the crime, was actually guilty, even though he was acquitted of the crime in 93. And I saw a bunch of other avenues that could be explored that nobody had looked into. So it was that moment where I realized, one, I wanted to write like this, and two, I could do it differently. Not necessarily better, but I could go a different route. And so I always kind of thought of the story, the basics of the story are that Lisa Pruett was 16 years old. This was September of 1990, and she had just gotten her driver's license, and her boyfriend, Dan Dreifert, had just gotten out of the psychiatric unit at Cleveland Clinic, where he had been for a little over a month. And, while he was in there, by the way, he had written her letters saying, "Please stay away from me when I get out. I don't want to kill you." And they devised a plan where she's going to sneak out of the house, out of her house, and then take her bike over to his house at about 12:30 in the morning that night. And only a handful of people knew about that. Dan told a couple friends, and then she's found stabbed to death about 30 feet from the boyfriend's back door. And then the next day, a few of the friends of the boyfriend and Lisa's, they were in this small little clique at school called the AP Posse for advanced placement. These were kids in advanced placement classes, and they got together and discussed the case. And then the next day, some of them went to the police and said, "Hey, it can't be our friend Dan. It has to be the weird kid in school, this Kevin Young, who, was I think today he would be considered neurodivergent. I suspect maybe he's on the spectrum, but I don't know that for sure. I can't diagnose people, but that would be my hunch. And there was never any evidence that links Kevin to the crime, but eventually he was charged, and there was a big trial in 93, and he was acquitted. But to this day, you ask anybody in Shaker Heights, and they'll say, "Oh, Kevin Young did it. He just hired a fancy lawyer to get him off." I, over the years, gathered thousands of pages of police reports and trial transcripts, and I thought one day I might have enough to write a book. And then COVID happened, and I found myself trapped at home and with nothing to do. The project I was working on in Las Vegas was shut down. I was working on a TV show. And so I had all this time, and like Burgess Meredith in The Twilight Zone, time enough at last. And so I cracked open the files, and I had two goals. One, I wanted to exonerate Kevin Young in the court of public opinion. And two, I wanted to show that the boyfriend was the most likely suspect. What I didn't expect to find is, about 2 weeks into my research, I came across evidence in those reports that showed that another young man named David Brannigan was at the scene of the crime the night of Lisa's murder. And when I started looking into his background, oh man, the stuff that came out of there, just very, very dark. I spoke to a number of his ex-girlfriends and his ex, the mother of his child, who he lived with for, I think, like 10 years. And they all agree that, he's probably the guy that not only killed Lisa Pruett, but he's linked to two other murders that occurred on the same city block.
Was there any evidence linking David Brannigan to this murder?
Well, no, only because they didn't test it to see if it could be anybody other than Kevin Young. So they were so focused on Kevin, they weren't considering other suspects. So, for instance, they have a fingerprint that was found on an item at the crime scene, and they tested it to see if it matched Kevin, and it didn't. And since it didn't, they didn't follow it up. So they've never tried to see if the fingerprint matches David Brannigan's. Both Brannigan and Kevin Young are now deceased. They both died, coincidentally, in 2017. Both drank themselves to death. So That's frustrating.
Yeah.
I really would have liked to have interviewed Brannigan and to see what kind of response he would have given. The rest of it's circumstantial. Brannigan admitted to breaking into homes around the time and on that block around the time of the murders, and he was stealing stuff from people's homes, not money, but little trinkets. And he had a collection of knives, and Lisa was stabbed to death, and they never did find the murder weapon. He describes being at the scene of the crime the night of the murder, where he describes the two cops that were searching the area, and they did not see him, which means that he was in hiding and watching them. And he's the only witness in this double homicide that occurred on the same block 5 years before that. And beyond that, there's a number of women that have come forward, alleging rape, alleging all these dark things. He would sneak into their houses and coerce them into sex, saying that if they made any noise and woke up the parents, he would say that she brought him into the house, stuff like that. He was a very dangerous man when he was younger, for sure.
When you do this, but because you're doing unsolved, and I know I've done solved, so when you approach the police and when you talk and when you do these kinds of books, do they feel a little bit, put off? Do they feel like they're being watched or questioned, I would imagine?
It's always different, and it runs the whole spectrum. I've had, I wrote about this case, the murder of Beverly Jaros that happened in Garfield Heights in 1964, and the police detectives for that case invited me in and opened up all their files to me, even though it was an active open case, all the way to like the Amy Mihalovic case, which I've written about a lot, where the police have never shared anything with me, and will only confirm what I've already found. So it's always a crapshoot. I find that smaller jurisdictions are often more helpful, especially if I can approach them in person first and make a relationship with the detective, and he can hear my Ohio accent. So it's different every time.
Yeah, I always wonder, because there's such a lot of times when you see true crime television programs, or different things, there seems to be a little bit of it's almost like an attack on policing.
Yeah.
They did a terrible job, or if they didn't screw it up. So you hear that kind of talk about the police in a lot of these shows that you see, and you kind of think, well, it's not always fair, but I just wondered if they feel a little bit timid about talking.
I think sometimes they were really reticent, I guess, to be involved with the Lisa Pruett book, but this Little Crazy Children, it was different than the other unsolved cases I've written about, because even though it was unsolved, all the police reports were actually public record, because here in Ohio, as soon as you charge somebody with a crime, like they did with Kevin Young, all those reports become public record. So most of the times when I'm writing about unsolved cases, I can't get the police reports. But with this one, even though it's never been solved, all the reports were public because of that loophole.
It's just amazing. And when they actually tried Kevin Young and he got acquitted, they didn't really have any evidence, or like what did they use to charge him and try him with?
So what they finally got that they viewed as enough to charge him with was testimony from a woman who was a patient at the same psychiatric unit as Kevin Young was after the murder. And this woman came forward a couple years after the murder to say that he confessed to her while they were both in the unit. Now, when they got her on the stand, and she told her story, it came out that night of the so-called confession, she was delusional and seeing visions of her father being tortured in World War II and all this wild stuff. And, she had not gone to the police, but she had gone to a TV news reporter to get on, and she got on the news, and they blacked out her face and everything, of course. But her motivation did not necessarily seem to be justice, but to maybe get on TV.
So how do you see the case now? Where do you see it? Things like this never really get resolved, do they?
I think they could resolve this one, but the Shaker Heights police and Shaker Heights, the town, they need to kind of admit that they did the wrong thing back in 1990 by going after Kevin Young. They've dug their heels in, even though he was acquitted, with him still being the only person that they'll look at. And if they just set that aside, and I'm hoping enough time has passed that now would be a good time to do it, they could go back and test the evidence, which they really haven't re-examined the evidence significantly since back then. They could see if Brannigan's fingerprint matches the fingerprint they found, or the shoe print matches the type of shoe he was wearing. And they could retest the evidence to see, there's so much advancement. Now it might be able to kick out some DNA or even other hairs or fibers. And then you've got this double homicide that I believe Brannigan's also responsible for, where a woman was strangled with the cord of an iron. And certainly you're going to have DNA of the killer on that thing. So just test the evidence. If they truly believe it's Kevin, then still test the evidence so you know for sure. But so far, they won't take that gamble.
Yeah. What do you think that is? Do you think that a lot of people suggest that it's just detectives or district attorneys that have a lot of ego?
I think it's simply apathy. I think they view it as they've already solved it, so why pay $500 for this test that would just prove that they were right anyways? The Lisa's family were convinced by the police and prosecutors that it was Kevin as well. So, maybe they look at it as like, well, why waste resources on this if we already know the answer?
Yeah. Yeah. I guess some of it makes sense, but some of it doesn't, because, when we're dealing with people's lives, I don't know that money and things like that should really be an issue. I guess it is in a way.
It shouldn't. Yeah, for sure. But unfortunately, I think, it is all the time.
Yeah. It's still a business.
Yeah. We unfortunately live in a capitalist system, and they have to take those things into account. But yeah.
Yeah, because everything has to be a business. It's crazy. But so whenever you've approached suspects, like I know, especially in the previous case, is there a certain way you go about doing that? How would you approach if these suspects were still alive and you wanted to go interview them? How would you do that?
I always try to meet them face to face at first, so they don't have the opportunity to hang up or just send me to voicemail. So I'll go out to their house and knock on their door, try to catch them outside and speak to them. And honestly, 90% of the time, they'll talk to me. And for a while, I couldn't really understand that because, and I saw this in the Amy Mihalovic case a lot. There's so many suspects in Amy's case. I mean, we're talking, the best the FBI's ever been able to do is a top 25 list of suspects. So there's plenty of people to talk to. Now, these people have been suspected of murdering a 10-year-old girl and have taken lie detector tests and have been interrogated. And you'd think the last thing they would do is speak to a reporter. But 90% of the time they will. And I think I figured it out eventually. I think they are part of this story, and this thing has happened to them, and they haven't been able to talk about it with anybody, or maybe their spouse, or, very few people. But that story is something that is interesting, and here comes a person who wants to hear about it. And I think it's just part of the human condition where they want to share their story, even if it makes them kind of look guilty or whatever. I think they're just happy to share the stories. That's what I've found anyways. Most of the time they'll talk.
Nobody attacking you yet, eh?
No, the only people that I've had problems with are these internet trolls that attach themselves to the cases either because they fall in love with the victim or they just want to create chaos in people's lives. And those have been much more dangerous than suspects in these cases. I've had these trolls in the Murray case, track my family down on vacation at the Outer Banks and leave a threatening message on the steps to the Honda we were renting. That changed a lot of things for me. The suspects aren't scary. It's these people, these anonymous people that are attracted to these cases for whatever reason.
How do you deal with that? I mean, the internet in itself, it's changed so many things. There's a lot of great things about it. There's certain things that it's amazing. You can see so much more, learn so much more, meet people and interact with people so much better than it used to be. And I think that's a fantastic thing. But at the same time, I mean, I personally, I get a lot of awful emails, which actually we just forward to Dave all the time. He's the Clarence I was hearing. But because, I'm crying in my room. So what do you do? Like, how do you, that in itself too, because every time you must need to have access because you want tips, you want people to pass on information, but you don't want the nut jobs coming out threatening your family. So do you have, what would you recommend? What am I supposed to do now?
I would recommend a couple things. The things that I do now are, be careful. The things that the pictures you post online don't show your exact location, for one. Two, assume that anybody who's reaching out to you through email or direct messages is not who they say they are. That happens a lot. And if they're sending you a tip and it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. So, verify, take the tip if it's interesting, but before you report on it, verify it somewhere else. I had, again, with the Murray case, I had a person reach out to me pretending to be a classmate of Maura's from UMass, who said he saw her alive with a specific friend of hers shortly before her disappearance in New Hampshire, and it would have changed the case completely. And I, by then, had enough experience to think, well, this sounds legit, but it does sound too good to be true. So I looked into the guy's name, and it turned out to be a student. He really was it really was the name of a student at UMass at the time. And he gave me his birth date too, because, he said he was in New Hampshire for his birthday. And so I did a background check, and yes, this guy's birth date was the day he said it was, but there's still something nagging at me with it. And, so I didn't report on it right away. I passed the info to police, and the police were quickly able to determine that it was not, in fact, really this guy, but another troll who had taken on that identity in order to try to get me to report false information on the case. I mean, it was really clever and convoluted, and I almost fell for it. And I think sometimes reporters do, fall for that sort of thing, even at major newspapers.
But you have to wonder what drives a person to do that. If it's not a political reason, you have to think, well, what was in it for him to make you want to do that?
I think they get off on it. I think that's the only explanation that makes any sense.
That's crazy. I think that's kind of the one negative thing I guess we could say about the internet is we certainly have learned a lot about the other people that live around us.
Oh yeah. Yep. With back to the Amy case, you start looking at her neighbors and, everybody, you look into somebody's back, everybody kind of looks like the suspect. They all have creepy stuff in their past. I interviewed an FBI agent about the Amy case, and he said, well, everybody in that neighborhood was weird when we looked into their background. Next door was this family that just looked like the all-American couple, and they, perfect to a fault. And we did a little digging and finds out the husband can only get off if the wife is standing over a glass table and pooping on it. And,
Bill O'Reilly. No, just.
So, there's a lot of stuff that goes on behind closed doors that just,
Yeah.
for good reason, but, once you really start digging into the background of people, so many crazy stuff comes out.
But that, learning that over the years, even for myself, it's changed the way, like a lot of times when I see crime programs or documentaries or shows now, I guess I'm jaded because you know that piece of information about how anybody can look like the suspect. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like they can take a lot of different characters around the victim or the victim's family, and they can make them sound so bad.
Oh yeah.
That I've kind of lost my, I don't know, interest a little bit in a lot of the shows. Yeah. So for me anyway, it's jaded me on a lot of it because now I don't always believe what I see when they're showing, and they kind of pick on a suspect or a couple of people and they make them look bad. And a lot of times being through the other side of it, when you're doing the research, you can come up with a handful of people that look bad.
To your point, I think actually to me, it makes me a little optimistic because knowing that your neighbors are weirdos too and have, these secrets and things that they're up to, I looked at kind of the optimistic side of that, which is this sort of crime is still very, very rare. And even though people are up to some weird things, generally they're decent people. I think it's a good sign that this sort of thing doesn't happen more often. And even though people are, doing strange things, they're not.
Yeah, they might have, they're getting the glass tables dirty, but that's, but, they're not out killing people.
Right.
Well, that's good. And plus then when they find out your secrets, it's okay.
Exactly right?
They're not looking like you as the suspect. No, it's not him. We know it's not James. He does weird stuff, but he's not like that.
I do think about that sometimes, like just the fact that, I'm in this world a lot and writing about it. I've told my wife, I'm like, do not die under any sort of mysterious circumstances. I'll be the first one they look at. Please, so, the searches I do for these books online, methods of murder and things like that would not look good in my search history. But hopefully, constantly checking my email on my phone provides alibi as far as location, for anything that would happen in the immediate area.
Absolutely. Well, I was just wondering, since you're only interested in unsolved cases, have you ever had a case solved while you were trying to complete the book?
No, I think about that a lot. And it's a concern, but it shouldn't be a worry because, you want these cases solved. So that would be a good thing.
Right.
And it might lead to a more interesting story that way. It's never happened. I've written about a couple stories that have been solved after I've written them. I think of the girls in Cleveland who were abducted and kept in the home of Ariel Castro for 10 years. Amanda Berry, Gina DeJesus, and Michelle Knight. And I had written about Amanda and Gina when I was a reporter and met with their families and really looked into the case. And what freaked me out was when it was solved. First of all, I was at my son was 5 at the time and he was in gymnastics and he was at practice and I'm sitting there with a group of other parents and I get this text message from a source inside the Cleveland Police Department that said, Amanda Berry and Gina DeJesus just walked out of a house on the west side. And I was like, holy.
How dare you?
And everybody looked at me and I'm like, oh, you're going to hear about it. And you're going to hear about it real soon. But I went back into my notes, because I had just written about it a couple years before that. And Ariel Castro's name was in my notes. And, it was because he was the father of one of, Gina DeJesus's friends. And it was the friend, Ariel's daughter who was the last person to see her. And so at the time, I went to my editor and I said, hey, I'd really like to interview this Arlene Castro. And we decided not to because she was still a juvenile. But I'm always going to wonder if I had talked to the girl or had gone to Ariel's house, if something would have happened differently. And so that haunts me a little bit. But the FBI had that information too. The police had that information too. So everybody was really close, but nobody followed up on that one little lead.
That's pretty amazing. Like when cases like that happened, when we have in a way, we have kind of a negative thought in general, I think, as people, like when someone goes missing and something happens, they're just going to be dead anyway. And there's all that sort of talk, and it's just amazing when something like that happens.
Yeah.
It's something you'd never expect either. It's just, wow. It's just, you can never get over it.
It was surreal to be in the epicenter of when that was happening. It was just, it's like if a UFO landed on the White House lawn type of feeling.
Right. Yeah. Well, at least they didn't find them in your house.
Yeah. That would have been a whole different story.
Yeah, then that would have been a news story, boy. Well, so now at the end of the day, when you write these books, and like your new book here, Little Crazy Children, what do you hope that the reader takes away from the book when they're finished?
I think I'd like them to take away a little bit of knowledge of the process of how criminal cases work and how fallible they can be, and how it's just humans that are working them, and humans make a lot of mistakes, and to see how the system is kind of broken in some ways, but still probably the best system that we could have at the moment, and the ripple effects of the crime, and also how it affects the people that are writing and reporting on it, all that behind the scenes stuff, and how it really works. Yeah.
I think for me, a lot of it too, I always say it's the bottom line is that, the police are human. Everybody is there's not always a conspiracy or bad people or good, it's just there's a lot of humans and mistakes happen, and sometimes things just happen. So what's next? You're doing this now, and you have you got a couple other projects going on at the same time, or do you just sort of recover for a while?
Well, this one, I had to, Little Crazy Children, even though it just came out like 2 or 3 weeks ago, it was done back in November of last year. Signed a contract with the same publisher, Kensington Citadel, and for 2 more true crime books. And I've already written the next one that'll come out next year. That's that Boy Scout book. And so that's been the first half of this year are the adventures that I took with that one, which include flying out to Pipestone, Minnesota to hang out with the Native Americans who mine the material that's used for a secret society inside this Boy Scout camp. And my trip to DC, where I met up with a person who does psilocybin therapy for people suffering from PTSD, and tripping out with him. And so lots of interesting quirky adventures in this next book.
Well, and the secret society let you go?
They are freaking out right now because they know the book's coming, and I don't know that it could survive after the book comes out. The stuff that goes on at that camp is insane, and I think once the parents realize what they've not been told, it's gonna upset some people. I'm hoping that the book does for summer camps what Jaws did for beaches.
Well, there you go. Or what Jaws 2 did. No.
Yes.
Yeah, awful. Anyway, now, so social media, how do you like to be found, or do you like to be found? I know that's kind of a question. But.
Well, the best place to go is just jamesrenner.com. That'll have links to everything else. I'm on, X or Twitter, formerly known as Twitter, and Facebook. And I've started putting things up on TikTok. Still trying to figure out how to work that one. But yeah, I'm all over the place.
TikTok. So you're up there dancing on TikTok?
Right. Actually, it's funny. I do have a video up there of me and my daughter. She's teaching me a dance. But some of it are clips from the podcast I do every week, which is True Crime This Week, comes out on Fridays. And Yeah, so there's crime-related stuff, but there's other things that are more personal in there too.
Fantastic. We will put all of that up on ours as well so people can find you with one click if they can't.
Thank you.
Really appreciate you being on the show.
Yeah.
And of course, your newest book, Little Crazy Children, it's a true crime tragedy of lost innocence. Yeah, another great book, of course. So the author, James Renner, thank you for being here.
Hey, thank you.
Thanks, James.
You bet.
You've been listening to the House of Mystery radio show. To find out more about our guests, hosts, or shows, go to www.houseofmystery.com.
Show's over for now.
Was it as good for you as it was for me? Yeah. Good night. This has been a production of Something Weird Media.
I'll be back.